Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, U.S. President Donald Trump marks his first year in office with a tide of controversy over the apparent tell-all book, Fire and Fury. And Mr. Trump takes a more conciliatory tone with the DPRK ahead of talks between Seoul and Pyongyang. Publishers of a new book, Fire and Fury, inside the Trump White House, about the Trump White House could barely keep up with the demand in the U.S. Capitol, with some buyers lining up at midnight to get their hands on the instant bestseller. Former Trump chief strategist Steve Bannon now called the book inaccurate, even though he was quoted as one of the sources. And the writer and some of the other sources the writer talked to are defending their accounts still today of the Trump administration.
They will be met with fire and fury.
Fire and fury, a term that Donald Trump used to threaten the DPRK's leader over his nuclear drills, has officially become the title of a new book. It has become an instant bestseller, despite the U.S. president's attempts to stop it from getting published.
As you said, we were very lucky to get hold of 20 copies, which sold extremely quickly.
Well, Steve is very committed.
Before the book was released, Mr. Trump blasted his former chief strategist, Steve Bannon, saying that he not only lost his job, he lost his mind. In the book, Bannon described a Trump Tower meeting between Donald Trump Jr. and a group of Russians during the 2016 presidential election campaign as treasonous and unpatriotic. The book's author, Michael Wolff, has welcomed Mr. Trump's attempts to stop the book from being sold, saying he should send the president a box of chocolates for the kind of publicity that money can't buy. While contents of the book may be disturbing to some, many find it worth reading to get a better understanding of the chaos behind the scenes at the White House.
Not many reporters are saying it, you know, because somebody on one of the shows said, well, they all have to keep relationships with the White House, and Michael Wolff doesn't. And so he can say what other people already know but can't say.
I think it's important as a citizen to understand what's going on in our government.
Me and my housemate were talking about it last night, because we read a chapter online, somebody already put it out, and we laughed the whole way through.
Fire and Fury inside the Trump White House is on the top of the list on Amazon after the publisher sped up the book's rollout plan ahead of its official release. Mr. Trump tweeted that he never granted Wolff access to the White House, saying that the publication is full of lies and misrepresentations. Wolff said he stood by everything in his book and called his time with the U.S. president certainly not off the record. Mr. Trump is on his second year in office, and the first month has been full of challenges. Whether he and the Republicans can ride out the swirl of controversy in the coming months is the big question.
So can Donald Trump ride out the controversy over the book Fire and Fury inside the White House? Our panelists weigh in for this discussion. Joining us in Washington, D.C., Douglas Paal, the Vice President of Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I hope, Mr. Paal, you could hear us. In San Jose, California, we have Mr. Huang Zhengyu, who is a former White House fellow. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. I want to start with you, Mr. Huang. Why do you think a, apparent gossip, political gossip book has become such a popular one, not only among the book readers, but also in political circles?
Well, hi, Tian Wei. Well, I think ever since Trump's election a year ago, he has remained in headlines throughout all media coverage. And so any book about him, especially an expose, I think would be very popular. But I really believe, in my opinion, that the biggest story here is how quickly the center of gravity within the Republican universe has shifted to Trump. I remember that at the beginning of his career, there was a lot of talk about major divisions within the Republican universe. The establishment Republicans, led by Mitch McConnell, hated Donald Trump. And there was an insurgent wing, led by the likes of Steve Bannon, who weren't 100% supportive of Donald Trump. But with this current incident, we see Bannon apologizing, his backers pulling away from him, and establishment Republicans actually coming to the aid and defense of Donald Trump. And so I think the bigger story here is really within a year, how Donald Trump has quickly coalesced the Republican universe around him, making him the center of gravity.
I see. But, Mr. Paal, do you think that this book actually could mark a new debate at the very beginning of a year about the quality of this presidency and what this presidency would mean for the United States in the new year and even for the rest of the world?
Well, I'm really kind of guessing from the atmosphere here, but I think that we sort of mark a turning point. The first year there was a tremendous obsession with the investigation by Special Counsel Mueller and what that might turn up in terms of convicting the Trump administration of doing something illegal with the Russians. The chances for that are still there, but not very high. And I think what's happened is that public attention in Washington is shifting now to try to force Trump out of office for incompetency, to use the 25th Amendment, which is the amendment to the Constitution, which would allow the Cabinet of the United States to remove the President if there's something wrong with his ability to function. And I think that's where the drift in public attention is going to go now for the next few months.
But Mr. Paal, let's just put aside whether President Trump is the most eloquent president ever in the U.S. history. Let's just put that aside because I guess the answer is very obvious. But let's just talk about what he has managed politically within 1 year's time, even for domestic politics, done so far. You got the tax reform. You also had the immigration reform, both of which have been pushed by the Republican parties for decades and not necessarily get done. And yet, during his 1 year term, no matter what the circumstances were, he got it done. So for party politics, how would you, as a long-time observer, and shall I say, also someone who could observe very close up to the Republican administrations for decades, how would you say about his performance?
Well, he did accomplish with the Congress the things that you mentioned, but he did it when he had majorities in the House, the Senate, he had the White House, and effectively the Supreme Court lined up with a conservative bias. So he should have had an open field for accomplishing a great deal. But the Republicans turned out not to be able to police their own ranks very well. There were mavericks in the Senate and quite a few people balking in the House of Representatives. And so it's a fairly thin list of accomplishments when you consider the institutional advantage that they started the year with.
Mr. Huang, thin accomplishments, considering the circumstances?
Well, I have to say, one thing that surprised me with Donald Trump vis-a-vis all previous other presidents is he's been very consistent with his campaign promises and what he's been attempting to deliver while in office. He promised what he wanted to do in immigration restrictions. He did exactly that. He talked a lot about tax reform and the partial repeal of Obamacare, and he tried to do exactly that. And I think that consistency we will likely see in 2018, and we will likely see throughout his tenure. Now, I do want to address this, I think, the approach on Donald Trump. I think that the Democrats have formulated 3 lines of attack, and it's become pretty clear. The first is potential obstruction of justice through the Russian probe, which is still ongoing. The second is his past sexual indiscretions, which I think will likely come up during the midterm elections. And then the third is his mental incapacity or incapability or incompetency. However, I think with the economy booming, there needs to be an economic line. If there's something that needs to be talked about Trump, I think there should be a focus on economy. Is there something that Trump is not doing well on the economy? And fundamentally underlying last year was a booming American economy.
All right. You haven't answered my question directly, Mr. Huang. Maybe you don't want to offend Mr. Paal, who is a very experienced scholar on U.S. politics and certainly on U.S.-China relations. But my question really is, do you think the achievements of Donald Trump as president for 1 year for the Republican administration has been thin or not?
Well, I think he's made significant achievements according to his agenda. The tax reform was passed, something that hasn't been passed in 30 years. There is a partial repeal of Obamacare, of the most important kind of the single-payer mandate that was repealed. And he's pushed through this immigration restriction, visa restriction program that went up all the way to the Supreme Court, and that was pushed his way. So I think in a sense, he's gotten several things that he could claim as credit and as victories, especially to his base. And again, I don't think he needs to serve the American public. He needs to serve his base. And his base, I think, are pretty happy with what he has achieved.
Well, you could argue he could serve his base, and he should also serve the American public because he is the president. I guess that's the description for the role of a president, to serve the American public. Having said that, though, of course, politics is different. Having said that, though, Mr. Paal, let's take a look at some of the things, you know, so-called the psycho attack against Donald Trump. The psycho attack has been appeared in party politics in the United States for quite some time. Donald Reagan was being attacked. Some of the Democrats, when they were campaigning against their Republican counterpart, they were being attacked. And now, of course, a very different president has been attacked. Do you think that is the way the politics is likely to run for the future, particularly the midterm election and leading up to the next presidential election, Mr. Paal? Mr. Paal?
There's no doubt in my mind that we're going to see a very partisan fight going forward. Trump has vulnerabilities, and the Democrats have been trying to exploit them. He has an agenda which is very contrary to the drift in the Democratic Party, which is more and more leftward, and he's trying to move it way back to the right. So I think that the opportunities for partisanship will be huge for the next election year, this midterm election year, and then on into the presidential election year in 2020.
Having said that, though, Mr. Paal, you know the reason why in China and in the rest of the world care about this, you know, apparent gossip, full of gossip book, and about, you know, the internal dirty political debate in the United States, is because we do not know whether that is going to spill over and have an impact on this presidency, and whether this presidency will function well for the development of the rest of the world. Mr. Paal, foreign policy, international relations-wise, what do you think President Trump has achieved, or not at all, Mr. Paal?
Well, you know, you can look at the relationship with China, which he said was going to be started by finding China a currency manipulator, and then he chose not to do that. He hosted in April a very successful seeming state visit, or a proper visit to Mar-a-Lago by President Xi, and then had a return state visit plus to Beijing, which would not have been in the cards if you had followed the campaign rhetoric. So I think you'll see him as having changed his agenda a little bit in foreign affairs. The preoccupation with Korea came in with his administration. He's put a lot of pressure on North Korea, very successfully mustering international support at the UN Security Council beyond any previous support for sanctions on North Korea. It might be a little early to start declaring victory, as was attempted last week when they said talking tough got North Korea to come back to the bargaining table. I think it's a bit too early to make that judgment, but certainly people in the camp supporting President Trump will point to that as an achievement of his first year in office.
Mr. Huang, we've seen in recent contemporary history of the United States different kinds of presidency and different styles of presidents. Some have shined at the very beginning of their presidency. Others seem to be only getting a better analysis after they left the White House. For example, Ronald Reagan. So, Mr. Huang, this, of course, is a very different president. He did not have much experience. He talked in a way most of the elites in the United States really do not want to have a second listen. So, Mr. Huang, how do you see this ups and downs of the qualities of presidents in terms of their communication skills with the rest of the country? I mean, the rest of the country, not just the constituencies, and also the rest of the world. Will they have an impact eventually on what this president could achieve, Mr. Huang?
Yes, I think this president will be talked about for a long time to come. Mainly dissecting how he, as an individual, as an outsider, as an outsider, has really transformed the office of the presidency. He's really brought, I think he's merged entertainment with politics in a way that no one has ever done before. Now that has crept into media for the past decade or so, but he's the one who's done it at the highest level of American politics. So I think that's going to be analyzed for a long time to come. Now his inability to articulate policy succinctly and clearly, repeating himself, often boastful and focused on show, and potentially deriding others based on their physical appearance, we actually saw all of that during the election campaigns. In fact, anyone who watched the debates saw that in ample abundance. So I don't think that's something that's new and that's going to change. One thing I do want to address is something that he's accomplished, and I think in the process of accomplishing that, it's not getting much coverage, which is his potential realignment of the Middle East. Prior to his administration, there was a focus on creating a balance of power between Sunnis and Shiites, a la President Obama. But I think Trump is fashioning an Israeli-Sunni coalition versus a Shiite coalition. And we saw that come into play when he formally moved the American ambassador to Jerusalem, actually without much protest in the Sunni world. And I think that's very critical because America is energy independent now. The region has distracted America's attention for the last several decades. And if this rivalry, if this arrangement is to hold, he might just extricate America from that region. Because we know that there's the tension that has existed thousands of years before the tension towards America, and is a tension within the region. And so that's something that I think if he's able to accomplish, he might just shift more attention towards the likes of Russia and China, which he has articulated in his national agenda.
I see. Mr. Paal, if you could hear me, 2 points. One is so-called the communication skills and the way of communication Mr. Huang mentioned. Will that have a direct impact on what this president could achieve? And secondly, I want you to talk more about international relations, but I will follow up with a concrete question. But first, the communication skills and the styles, Mr. Paal.
Well, you know, it's an interesting study in human nature to watch how Trump has come in with this world of tweets. And we have no previous experience at that level of people tweeting so cavalierly and so frequently. And yet we've gotten used to it. We've adjusted to it. People from foreign governments no longer put all the weight on what President Trump says in his tweets. They make inquiries to the Defense Department or State Department, try to find out what the underlying policy is. And often they are reassured that it's not all that different from what it had been before. Not always, but often. And so we've adjusted to this new form of communication in ways that I would have found very difficult for us as a nation, as an institution in Washington to adapt to.
Second point, Mr. Paal, that is whether President Trump has managed to do something also about foreign policy that the previous administration has not even thought about or would not even be able to dare to touch. For example, the U.S. so-called interest in the Middle East. And secondly, in Asia, the Korean Peninsula issue, particularly the Korean nuclear issue, has this President Trump be able to, just zigzagging his way? He's just fighting all the time in all different kinds of corners and eventually just push out some kinds of solutions. I mean, for the American interest, if we knew what the American national interests are at this point. Mr. Paal.
Trump has been trying to reduce the conservative impulses to reduce America's footprint around the world and at the same time to be more consequential in the world. And these are complicated objectives. They conflict with each other frequently. So as Mr. Huang said, we're making adjustments in Middle East policy, but whether that's coherent or not is not clear to me. We've doubled down on troops in Iraq, Syria, and now Afghanistan. When you would have thought you'd be pulling troops out and ending the commitments there. We've gotten more entangled in Pakistan because we have troops in Afghanistan and we're trying to protect them rather than to get ourselves extricated from thereafter. As Trump complained, we spent $36 billion and had nothing to show for it. In the Far East, he's talked a few times about an Indo-Pacific strategy and an effort to, he's made an effort to reach out to the Malaysian and Thai leaders and the Filipino leaders who have drifted away from America. The U.S. remains consequential in all those countries. In the absence of another country's leadership, there's really only the U.S. And so even if we don't try to lead, people look at us as if we are leading because we have such heavyweight interests in so many capitals and so many economies in both the Middle East and the Far East.
I see.
So you can't just walk away from the role of being the world's leader when you've got such a substantial portion of the military and economic capability in the world.
Well, I did notice, Mr. Paal, you used the word, an adjective, which is consequential. That seems to be a word that many people have been talking about recently. I don't need to quote the exact quote coming from the president. But for now, we talk about President Donald Trump for the very first year. There's certainly a lot to be done, a lot to be seen for this presidency. Thank you so much, Douglas Paal, and also Huang Zhengyu for being with us. And Mr. Paal, you're going to stay with us for the next discussion on the Korean Peninsula. Thank you.